The shouts echoed through the communal hall as Halvard, the blind Skald, was dragged away from Sigrid. His hands, still warm from their forbidden touch, reached out into the empty air, while the clanmen pulled him toward the judgment circle. "She is the sacred widow of Thorvald the Just. Her touch is forbidden until the next solstice," Gunnar's stone hands shouted as the crowd roared for punishment. Thank you for joining us in this story. Our channel is just beginning this journey, and every subscription truly helps keep this project alive as we reach for our first 1,000 followers. If you find value in these tales, please consider subscribing and sharing your city in the comments below. Your support means more than you know. The dawn crept quietly over the frozen fields surrounding Ravnholm, painting the horizon with pale strokes of icy pink and cold gold. It was a morning like many others, yet one that carried the weight of unspoken tension and fragile hope. Inside a small weathered cabin at the edge of the village, Halvard Olafsson stirred from sleep, his senses awakening slowly as they always did, without sight, but never without feeling the world's pulse. The air was thin and sharp with the bite of early winter, seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls, curling around the edges of the animal skins that served as curtains. The cabin was modest, rough-hewn logs stacked unevenly, a low roof that barely kept out the snow, and a simple hearth where embers had long since died to ashes. The faint scent of pine smoke lingered in the air, mingled with the earthy musk of damp wool and bark. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the skeletal branches of the birch trees, carrying the distant calls of ravens and the faint crackle of ice breaking along the frozen river. Halvard's body moved with the certainty born of years navigating a world without sight. His fingers brushed against the familiar runes carved deeply into the oak post near his bed, a ritual he performed each morning to ward off dark spirits that, the old folk said, prowled in the blindness of his eyes. The runes felt rough and cool beneath his skin, their sharp edges etched with stories older than any living soul in Ravnholm. To Halvard, they were a bridge to a world he could no longer see, a safeguard against the shadows that lurked in silence. Though his eyes were glazed with a milky blue that denied him vision, Halvard's other senses had sharpened beyond measure. His hearing was attuned to the faintest footsteps on frozen ground. His hands skilled at reading the stories written in the grain of wood or the weave of cloth. His voice, the gift of Bragi, the god of poetry, was his true weapon now, a tool to wield words with precision and power. At 37, Halvard was a man caught between worlds. He had not always lived like this. Once he had stood proud among the shield brothers of Ravnholm, a warrior steadfast in battle and loyal in council. But 5 winters ago, a violent fever had struck him down and stolen his sight, leaving his world shrouded in endless night. Since then, he had become a skald, a singer of tales, a keeper of memory, a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. From the threshold of his cabin, Halvard could hear the faint rustle of activity in the village beyond. The clatter of wooden wheels over frozen earth, the murmur of voices greeting the new day, the distant clang of the smith's hammer striking iron. These sounds were a symphony of life, a constant reminder that while the world had grown smaller for him, it went on, relentless and indifferent. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he sat at the edge of his simple bed, fingers tracing the worn strings of his harp. The instrument was a companion through long, cold nights, its wood smoothed by years of touch, its tone both haunting and tender. He plucked a few tentative notes, feeling the vibrations hum through his fingertips and up his arms. Music was the language that carried his soul. Through it he could reach others and weave the threads of memory that bound the clan together. A soft knock at the door stirred him from his reverie. The rhythm was familiar, light and careful. Sigrid's. She came every morning, threading through the village shadows before the sun fully claimed the sky, bearing offerings of food and warmth, a gesture that was as much about kindness as it was about defiance. Halvard, her voice was low, gentle as the breeze through the pines. I brought bread and goat cheese, fresh from my larder. His hand reached out instinctively before he even heard the scrape of the door opening. The scent of the bread was rich and yeasty, mingled with the sharp tang of the cheese, a gift in a world where every morsel was earned through toil and hardship. "Thank you, Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir," Halvard said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude and something deeper, more fragile. "Your kindness honors me more than you know." She stepped inside, her presence filling the small room with a warmth that seemed almost unnatural against the chill. The soft rustle of her woolen dress, the faint scent of herbs woven into her braid, the steady rhythm of her breath, all these details painted a picture in Halvard's mind, sharper than any sight could offer. For a moment neither spoke. The crackle of the dying fire was the only sound between them, a fragile thread holding the quiet together. Halvard could feel her hesitation, the unspoken burden she carried, like the veil of white linen she wore, a symbol of grief and respect, but also of isolation. "There is talk in the village," she finally said, her voice trembling just slightly. "The council will meet today. They speak of the widow's future." Halvard's fingers tightened around the harp's frame. The mention of the council was like a cold wind cutting through his chest. Thorvald, Sigrid's husband, had been a man of great honor, a respected warrior and advisor to Jarl Erik. His sudden death left more than sorrow. It left a power vacuum that many eyes now sought to fill. "Gunnar Stonehands has been visiting my brother," Sigrid continued, her tones shadowed by unease. "He offers promises and alliances, and claims he will marry me once the mourning ends." Halvard's heart clenched. Gunnar was everything Ravnholm feared and despised in a man. Brutal, unyielding, and merciless to those who stood in his way. His hands, large and scarred, had crushed more than enemies. They had broken the spirits of those too weak to resist. "I do not wish to marry him," Sigrid confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Halvard's fingers sought hers in the dim light, finding them rough from hard labor, but steady. Her touch was a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. For months, their secret exchanges had become the only solace from the harsh judgments and cold gazes of their neighbors. "Tell me of the lands beyond Ravnholm," she said suddenly, a plea flickering in her eyes. "Of the places you've seen before the darkness claimed you." Halvard closed his eyes, letting the memories flood over him. The rolling green fields of Saxony, the towering stone temples of strange gods, the bustling marketplaces where tongues from distant shores mingled like the wind. He spoke of rivers wide as seas, of forests thick with ancient magic, of skies that stretched beyond the imagination. His voice wove images that transcended the limits of his blindness, painting a world beyond the confines of their icy village. Sigrid listened, her breath hitching as silent tears traced cold paths down her pale cheeks. "I wish to see those places," she murmured at last. "You could," Halvard replied, the words braver than he felt. "You could leave Ravnholm behind, start anew." "A woman alone?" The doubt was heavy in her voice, thick with the weight of tradition and fear. "Not alone," he said, the promise clear and unwavering. In that quiet moment, something fragile and fierce passed between them, a bond forged not in sight, but in trust and longing. Sigrid moved closer, the warmth of her body a stark contrast to the cold walls around them. Her hands cupped his face with a tenderness that spoke of battles fought in silence.
Their lips met, a brief, forbidden touch that carried the weight of all they dared not say. It was a kiss that defied the laws of the clan, a spark in the frozen darkness. Yet, before it could deepen, the cabin door slammed open, and the cold wind rushed in like a furious god. The heavy footsteps and harsh voices shattered the fragile peace. Gunnar's presence was unmistakable. The scent of sweat and mead, the grating sound of anger in his voice. "So it is true," he bellowed. "The sacred widow and the blind Skald, a profanation!" Halvard's heart thundered in his chest as Sigrid was torn away, her muffled cry slicing through the cold air.
Pain flared through his body, a blow to the stomach folding him in half. "Do not touch her!" he roared, desperation fueling his voice. But his hands grasped only emptiness. "Bring them to the hall," Gunnar commanded, his voice a cruel echo in the narrow room. "The council will judge this offense against the gods." And so, the day that had dawned with quiet hope now darkened under the shadow of wrath and judgment. Halvard was dragged from the warmth of his cabin into the biting chill of the world beyond, his fate entwined with the whisper of traditions long held and the fierce desire to rewrite them. Outside, the village was already stirring, the scent of roasting meat and spilled mead blending with the tension that hung thick in the icy air. The drumbeat of feet on frozen earth echoed the beating of a heart caught between past and future. As Halvard was pulled toward the communal hall, his mind raced, recalling every story he had ever sung, every lesson etched into his soul. The coming trial would test not only his voice and will, but the very fabric of a people bound by honor and fear. And deep within, beneath the blindness that had once seemed a curse, a spark of defiance was kindling, ready to blaze a new path through the cold winter of tradition. The cold winter wind howled outside the walls of Ravnholm's communal hall, rattling the wooden beams and carrying with it the bitter scent of snow and ice. Inside, the hut's warmth clung to Halvard's skin like a fragile shield against the growing storm of voices and accusations. His hands still trembled faintly from the harsh grip of Gunnar's men, but his mind was sharper than ever, focused on the trial looming ahead. Yet, amid the chaos, a sound reached him, a soft, uneven crying, barely audible over the murmurs and shuffles of the gathered crowd. His heightened hearing caught the subtle shift in the room, a faint movement in the shadows near the rafters where the firelight faltered. Halvard's senses strained, reaching beyond the tumult, until he discerned the unmistakable sobs of a child, a small voice caught in fear and loneliness. He turned his head slowly toward the source, the rough floorboards creaking beneath his weight as he stepped cautiously, guided by memory and instinct rather than sight. "Who's there?" he called softly, voice low but steady, cutting through the noise like a blade softened by care. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a hesitant silence. Then, barely a whisper, "Please, I'm cold." Halvard's heart tightened. The voice was small, trembling, and achingly young, a child lost within the gathering of harsh, judgmental men. He reached out with his hand, fingers brushing the rough wood beams as he sought the presence hidden in the dark. "Who's there?" he called softly, voice low but steady, cutting through the noise like a blade softened by care. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a hesitant silence. Then, barely a whisper, "Please, I'm cold." Halvard's heart tightened. The voice was small, trembling, and achingly young, a child lost within the gathering of harsh, judgmental men. He reached out with his hand, fingers brushing the rough wood beams as he sought the presence hidden in the dark.
"Come to me," he urged, voice gentle, a quiet promise in the chaos. A moment passed, then a faint rustling. Tiny footsteps, uneven and unsure, approached Halvard's outstretched hand. The child's fingers, icy and fragile, found his and clung desperately. The warmth of that touch was like a spark amid the cold, a fragile lifeline binding two souls amid a world teetering on judgment and wrath. "Why are you here?" he whispered, kneeling carefully to keep his balance. His breath fogged in the frigid air, mingling with the scent of smoke and sweat. "You shouldn't be among the clan this way, alone." The child shivered, voice barely audible. "I ran away from the fire." Halvard's mind raced. Fires were rare but devastating in the winter. They could consume an entire hall, leaving nothing but ash and sorrow. To flee such destruction was to escape death itself. Yet who would abandon a child in the biting cold? The thought twisted the knot in his chest tighter. "Where is your family?" he asked, careful not to startle the small figure trembling in his grasp. "No one left, only me," the child replied, voice breaking. A heavy silence fell between them. Halvard could feel the weight of the child's desperation, a fragile flicker of a life endangered, abandoned. The clan's eyes in the hall were harsh and unforgiving, and to be found near the Skald, accused and disgraced, put even greater peril on the child's shoulders. His heart ached with helplessness and fury at the cruel world that cast such innocence into shadow. Yet he also knew the dangers of harboring a child in these fraught times. Suspicions, accusations, reprisal from Gunnar, or worse. Still, the choice was clear. "Come," he said quietly, rising with deliberate care. "We will find shelter. You will not face the night alone." As he moved toward the corner of the hall near the door, Halvard's fingers wove a protective path along the walls, steadying himself and the child. The heat from the cracked hearth was faint, but enough to offer some comfort. He could feel the child's small body pressed close, heartbeat rapid and uneven beneath his hand. 1,000 thoughts battled within him, the risk of further wrath from the clan, the vulnerability of his own position, the danger of defying tradition more than he already had. But none outweighed the flicker of hope sparked by this small life clinging to him in the darkness. Outside, the wind continued to batter the wooden walls, a relentless reminder of harsh winters and harsher hearts. But inside, in that moment, a fragile sanctuary was forged, one born not of sight or strength, but of compassion and defiance. Halvard whispered promises neither could fully understand, yet both desperately needed to hear. "You are not forgotten, not while I live." As the crowd's voices swelled, and the council prepared to judge, Halvard felt a new burden settle upon his shoulders, one not of shame, but of fierce responsibility. The path ahead was more uncertain than ever, tangled with peril and hope intertwined.
Yet, as he held the child close, the blind Skald knew that some battles were fought not with weapons or words, but with the unyielding courage to protect the helpless, to challenge the cold cruelty of fate itself. And so, in the frozen heart of Ravnholm, beneath the watchful eyes of ancestors unseen, Halvard made his choice. A choice that would change not only his destiny, but the very fabric of the clan's future. Halvard moved slowly through the shadows of the communal hall, the child's fragile fingers curled tightly around his own. The warmth of that small hand was a stark contrast to the biting cold that seeped through the thick wooden walls. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind him like a distant storm, replaced by the soft scrape of his boots on the frozen earth outside. The bitter wind greeted them harshly, biting through the layers of wool and leather. But Halvard welcomed the sting. It was a reminder that he was alive, that this moment mattered.
The child's breathing was uneven, small breaths hitching between shivers. Halvard adjusted his cloak, wrapping it tighter around both of them, careful not to crush the frail frame pressed against him. He could feel the child's head trembling against his side, a weight too light to be real, yet heavy with fear and exhaustion. They moved toward Halvard's cabin at the edge of Ravnholm, a humble refuge standing stubborn against the relentless winter. The path was familiar to Halvard. Each footprint in the snow, each crack in the frozen soil, mapped indelibly in his mind. His fingers brushed against the rough bark of the birch trees lining the way, grounding him as he navigated the world through touch and memory rather than sight. The child's fingers tightened in response, gripping his hand as if it were the only anchor in a vast, unknowable sea. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the faint lingering smoke of a hearth long cooled. Halvard's hands moved deftly, lighting kindling and coaxing a flame to life. The flickering fire cast dancing shadows that played against the walls, weaving stories in smoke and amber light. The child, still shivering, was gently guided to a place near the fire. Halvard's calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness as he pulled a thick blanket from a wooden chest and wrapped it around the small shoulders. There was a quiet dignity in the child's stillness, a wary acceptance of the sanctuary, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Halvard reached for a small wooden bowl, fetching warm broth from a simmering pot on the stove. The aroma of roasted root vegetables and dried herbs filled the room, a subtle comfort against the harshness of the world outside. He brought the bowl close, murmuring softly, "Drink, little one, it will warm your bones." The child hesitated, then accepted the offering with trembling hands, tilting the bowl carefully. The warmth was immediate, spreading through cold limbs like a balm.
Halvard watched the subtle changes, the way the child's fingers relaxed around the bowl, the slight easing of the tense shoulders. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the faint, uneven sip of broth. Halvard's ears caught the subtle noises, the soft intake of breath, a quiet sigh, the tentative shuffling as the child shifted closer. It was a language without words, a conversation woven through presence rather than speech. Halvard's hands traced the child's hair, feeling the fine strands, dark with hints of auburn, tangled and damp. His fingers lingered near the nape of the neck, where a faint mark caught his touch, a small scar, crescent-shaped and pale against the smooth skin. It was a symbol of past wounds, perhaps a burn or an old cut, telling a story the child had yet to find words for. He offered a soft hum, a melody carried from the depths of his soul, hoping to soothe the invisible ghosts that clung to the fragile figure before him. The child's hand moved tentatively, brushing against Halvard's wrist, a shy, searching gesture that spoke of cautious trust. "Your name?" Halvard asked gently, though he knew the sound might be unfamiliar, like a stranger in a silent world. The child's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible above the firelight's crackle. "Ira," came the name, soft as falling snow. Halvard let the name settle between them, a delicate thread knitting them closer. "Ira," he repeated, tasting the word as if it held the promise of something new. "You are safe here." The child's eyes, wide and filled with shadows, met Halvard's face, not seeing, but feeling the quiet strength there. It was a moment suspended in time, where fear met compassion, and worlds collided in the warmth of a small cabin. Halvard moved to gather a few more scraps, a piece of dried venison, some hard cheese, offering them in small bites, coaxing nourishment into the fragile body. Ira accepted cautiously, the act of feeding bridging the gap between survival and trust.
As the evening deepened, Halvard wrapped the child in layers of soft wool and fur, his own cloak discarded over their shared warmth. He settled beside Ira on a simple straw mat, the firelight bathing them in an amber glow. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken promises and fragile hope. At times, Ira's small hand would seek Halvard's, fingers intertwining in quiet reassurance. The blind Skald felt the weight of that trust as deeply as any blade. It was a bond forged not in sight or strength, but in the courage to hold on when all else threatened to fall away. Halvard's mind wandered to the child's story, the flight from some nameless danger, the solitary survival. Ira's clothes were simple, worn thin at the edges, dyed in muted earth tones that spoke of a life far from the clans of Ravenholm. There was a faint accent in her speech, subtle and unplaceable, as though she carried the distant echoes of lands beyond the fjords.
But more than words or origins, it was Ira's quiet resilience that stirred something deep within Halvard. Despite the terror and loss, there was a flicker of defiant life, a will to endure that mirrored his own journey through darkness. The night deepened, and the cold pressed against the windows like a living thing. Yet inside the cabin, guarded by fire and whispered songs, two souls found a fragile refuge. Halvard's fingers traced gentle patterns on Ira's back, a silent lullaby that spoke of safety and belonging. As sleep claimed them both, Halvard dreamed not of battles or ancient sagas, but of a future unwritten, a path where sight was measured not in eyes, but in the courage to see beyond fear, beyond tradition, beyond the shadows that sought to bind them. And in that quiet night, beneath a sky veiled in cloud and snow, a new story began. A story of trust, of healing, and of the light that can emerge from even the deepest darkness. The brittle silence that had settled over Ravenholm after the tumultuous council meeting was fragile, a thin veneer barely holding back the undercurrents of fear and suspicion that teemed beneath. Word of the Skald's defiance and the forbidden union with the widow had spread swiftly, carried on the tongues of whispers and murmurs like wildfire through the frost-bitten village. Yet the deeper secret, the presence of the child Ira, hidden in Halvard's cabin, remained a shadow cast beyond the eyes of most. But shadows have a way of shifting, of reaching into places no one expects. It began with small signs. The footprint of a stranger pressed into the snow near the edge of the forest, too large and unfamiliar to be a villager's. The hushed voices of travelers passing by the mouth of the ravine, murmuring questions about the Skald's name and fate. The heavy scent of foreign horses lingering too long near the village's water source, stirring unease in the dogs and the old hunters who knew the land better than anyone else. One evening, as Halvard sat by the fire, the door to his cabin rattled softly, then groaned open with a slow inevitability. The cold wind followed, sharp and intrusive. A figure stood framed in the doorway, tall, cloaked, and wearing the marks of a traveler. Worn boots caked with mud from distant lands, a hood pulled low over a weathered face. The stranger's eyes were sharp, dark as the soil after a storm, filled with a quiet intensity that made Halvard's pulse quicken. "Halvard Olafsson," the visitor said, voice low but commanding. "I have come with news and warnings." Halvard's heart skipped, a flicker of unease, but also a strange flicker of hope. News was currency in these lands. Warnings often meant power shifting beneath the ice. "Speak," Halvard replied, steady but cautious, his fingers tightening on the edge of his cloak. The stranger's gaze flicked beyond the cabin's threshold, perhaps catching the faint outline of the child curled near the fire. A shadow passed over his face before he continued. "The tale of the blind Skald and the widow has reached beyond Ravenholm. It rides on the wind like a wildfire, stirring old grudges and new ambitions. You have enemies, more than one, and not all are bound by your clan's laws or honor. Halvard's mind raced. Gunnar Stonehands was one threat, brutal and unrelenting, but this felt larger, a looming storm beyond the borders they had long thought secure. The clans beyond the fjords were known for their grudges, some simmering for generations, waiting for sparks to ignite fresh bloodshed. And the child? Halvard asked quietly, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Have they learned of her? The visitor's eyes darkened. There are hunters who seek out strays, and those who see a child alone as a weakness to be exploited. You shelter her at great risk. Halvard's chest tightened. The warmth of the fire could not stave off the cold dread that seeped into his bones. Protecting Ira was no longer a quiet rebellion. It was a challenge to the forces gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Why come here? What do you want from me? Halvard's voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of a man standing at the edge of a precipice. Not all in the world wish you harm, the traveler said, stepping fully inside, brushing snow from his cloak. Some seek to parley, to understand the winds that shift beneath us. I represent a faction that values the Skald's word and the woman's courage. But they demand a choice. Surrender the child or face the wrath of those who view your defiance as a threat to order. Halvard's fingers curled into fists. The choice was impossible. Betray the fragile life he had sworn to protect, or invite destruction on all they held dear. Your clan has already judged me harshly, Halvard said slowly, voice thick with the weight of years and loss. Yet I stand by the path I have chosen. I will not let fear dictate my actions. The visitor nodded, a flicker of respect in his expression. Then you must prepare. The eyes watching Ravenholm are many, and their patience thin. You will not face this alone. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the distant howls of wolves and the faint clatter of armor on frozen ground. The night was no longer just cold. It was alive with threat. News traveled fast in the north, and Ravenholm was no exception. By dawn, murmurs of strangers at the village's edge had stirred the people from their sleep like a restless tide. Hunters returning from the forest spoke of unfamiliar tracks and the distant echo of voices foreign to their ears. The smith, a grizzled man named Torvald, warned that these were not mere travelers or traders, but scouts, sentinels of a force that moved with purpose and shadow. Halvard sat quietly in the corner of the communal hall, fingers absently plucking the strings of his harp. News traveled fast in the north, and Ravenholm was no exception. By dawn, murmurs of strangers at the village's edge had stirred the people from their sleep like a restless tide. Hunters returning from the forest spoke of unfamiliar tracks and the distant echo of voices foreign to their ears. The smith, a grizzled man named Torvald, warned that these were not mere travelers or traders, but scouts, sentinels of a force that moved with purpose and shadow. Halvard sat quietly in the corner of the communal hall, fingers absently plucking the strings of his harp. His skin prickled beneath the watchful gazes of villagers who eyed him with suspicion or thinly veiled disdain. The presence of Aya was still hidden, but the tension was palpable, like the taut string of a bow drawn tight, ready to snap. The village was bracing for something they could not yet name, a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, threatening to shatter the fragile peace they had clung to.
Sigrid sat near the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she tended to her wounds, small cuts and bruises from the skirmish with Gunnar's men days before. Her eyes were wary, sharp with growing resolve. She had become more than a widow in mourning, the weight of leadership pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "You cannot hide forever," she whispered to Halvard when their eyes met across the room. "They will come for the child, for us." Halvard nodded, a grim set to his jaw. "We will face them, together." But even as they made this silent pact, the chill outside seemed to seep further into the bones of Ravenholm. Hunters and warriors gathered, their voices low and urgent. Stories of nearby clans questioning Ravenholm's strength, of whispers that the Skald's defiance was a crack in the fortress of tradition, inviting ruin. One evening, as the sky burned with the last embers of daylight, a group of rough men, strangers yet unmistakably fierce, arrived at the village's edge. Their leader was a towering figure, scarred and grim, eyes sharp as flint. He bore the colors of a rival clan, one long at odds with Ravenholm over borders and old blood debts. "We come for the child," the leader declared, voice booming over the hushed crowd. "The Skald's refuge is no place for weakness. She is a burden that will bring war upon you all." The hall fell into a heavy silence. Threats were not new, but this was a declaration, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a village already weary from internal strife. Jarl Erik rose, his white hair catching the firelight. His gaze swept over the assembled faces before settling on Halvard. "This is no longer a matter of clan customs or mourning rites," the Jarl said gravely. "It is a test of our strength and our will to protect what is just." Halvard's fingers tightened around his harp's armrest. The moment had come, no longer a quiet struggle beneath the shadows, but a reckoning in the open, raw and unforgiving. That night, the village gathered beneath the stars, the cold biting, but the firelight fierce and unyielding. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and leather, the murmurs of warriors sharpening into whispered strategies. Halvard stood among them, the weight of his blindness pressing down like never before. Yet his voice was steady as he spoke. "We face more than just men with swords," he said quietly. "We face the fear of change and the blindness of old grudges. But we also hold something stronger, the courage to protect the innocent and the strength to challenge what no longer serves us."
Sigrid stepped beside him, her hand finding his. Together, they were a symbol, not of weakness or defiance alone, but of the hope that could grow even in frozen soil. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the distant clash of steel and the restless cries of those who would see Ravenholm broken. The battle ahead was not simply for land or honor, but for the very soul of a people caught between the darkness of the past and the uncertain dawn of a new way. Halvard closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the village, the heartbeat of those who would stand with him, who would fight not with axes or shields, but with stories, with voices raised against the silence of fear. In the depths of the night, beneath a sky he could no longer see, the blind Skald prepared to face the world. For Ira, for Sigrid, and for the fragile light of a future still waiting to be born. The night air pressed against the walls of Halvard's cabin like a living thing, cold and unyielding, seeping into every crack, every crevice. Within, the flickering fire cast long, trembling shadows that danced across the rough-hewn beams and the worn tapestries draped over the walls.
The small space was heavy with unease, and the quiet breath of the child, Ira, nestled close beside Halvard. Outside, the winds carried the distant howls of wolves, the restless stirring of a world poised on the edge of violence. Halvard's fingers traced the strings of his harp absent-mindedly, the notes barely more than whispers in the thick air. His mind was a tempest, fury, fear, hope, and sorrow, all intertwined in a tangle too complex to unravel. The visitor's warnings earlier that day had settled deep in his bones. The threats were no longer distant rumors or veiled power plays among clans. They were immediate, tangible, and closing in like the cold night itself. Sigrid's presence was a steadying force beside him, though even her bravery could not hide the tremor of worry in her voice when she spoke. "They will come," she said, eyes dark and unwavering. "Tonight or soon after. We must be ready." Halvard's heart tightened. The child stirred, small fingers curling into his cloak for warmth. Ira's survival had become a beacon for all that was fragile and precious, not just for them, but for the entire village. If they failed to protect her, it would be more than a loss of life. It would be the crushing of hope, of possibility. Outside, the first shadows of figures moved against the snow-laden trees. The sounds were muted, soft boots pressing into fresh powder, hushed commands given in voices roughened by frost and resolve. The enemy was near, a storm gathering at the very gates of Ravenholm. Halvard rose slowly, the weight of blindness pressing heavily down on him. But his voice cut through the tense silence like steel. "We will not back down. Not now." Sigrid nodded, her hands steady, as she prepared what scant weapons they had, knives, clubs, and shields worn thin by use, but no less fierce in their promise. The villagers, roused by the threat, gathered with grim determination, forming a line that marked the boundary between shelter and chaos. The door to Halvard's cabin creaked open just as the first moonlight spilled through the frost-covered window panes. A chorus of voices rose outside, harsh, demanding, and unyielding. Gunnar Stonehands led the charge, his breath ragged with cold and rage, eyes blazing with all the fury of a man who believed the world owed him dominion. "You shelter the child of strangers," Gunnar snarled as his boots cracked on the threshold. "You defy the laws that bind us. That child is a curse, a mark of weakness. And you, Skald, you bring shame upon Ravenholm." Halvard's voice was calm but resolute. "Ira is no curse. She is life. Life we choose to protect, even when it runs against our fears and old ways." Gunnar spat on the floor, his massive hands clenched into fists. "You speak like a god, but you are nothing but a blind fool. Your words cannot shield you from justice." Around them, the villagers shifted uneasily. Some glanced toward Gunnar, a symbol of brutal order and tradition. Others looked to Halvard, the Skald, whose voice had already begun to unravel the iron grip of their customs. The air was thick with the weight of choice. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the air, the sound of a shield splitting under a powerful blow. Chaos erupted. Gunnar's men surged forward, pushing against the defenders with the force of a winter storm. The clang of wood against wood, the thud of boots on frozen earth, and the cries of battle filled the night. Halvard felt a surge of adrenaline and fear, the familiar rush of conflict, but one he could no longer face with sword or shield. Instead, he raised his harp, the small instrument gleaming with a faint, otherworldly glow in the firelight. His fingers struck the strings, and a haunting melody spilled into the night, wrapping around the shouting and clamor like a thread of calm. He sang, not of war or victory, but of the fragile bonds that hold people together in a world ruled by fear and change. His voice rose, raw and clear, cutting through the noise with a power that felt almost sacred. The song told of the child's flight from fire and death, of a skald's blindness that saw deeper truths, of a widow's courage to choose love over chains. Slowly, the storm of fury began to waver. Gunnar's men faltered, their faces twisting with confusion and anger. The power of Halvard's words was undeniable. It spoke to something buried within even the hardest hearts, a longing for mercy, for understanding, for a future not shackled by old wounds. But Gunnar was unyielding. With a roar, he broke free from the hesitant ranks and lunged toward Halvard, fury igniting every muscle. The blind Skald could not see the raised axe, nor the iron-hard fist sweeping through the air. Pain exploded across his side as the blow landed, sending him staggering back.
Yet even as the world blurred at the edges, Halvard's voice did not falter. He sang louder, the melody growing fiercer, an invocation to the gods, a plea for strength, honor, and the courage to change. His song became a shield woven from hope and defiance, and the villagers rallied behind it, their fear transforming into resolve. Sigrid moved swiftly through the chaos, her hands clutching a dagger as she confronted Gunnar. Their eyes locked, a silent battle waged between will and violence. "This ends tonight," she said, voice low but fierce. "Not with broken bodies, but with new paths." Gunnar snarled, but the fire in Sigrid's gaze gave him pause. The sound of voices raised in unison, villagers chanting the Skald's song, grew louder, weaving through the night like a spell. The tide turned. Gunnar's forces, battered by the unexpected unity and strength, began to retreat, their shouts fading into the cold wind. The threat was repelled, but the cost was clear. Halvard sagged against the frozen wall, his breath ragged, blood staining his tunic. Sigrid knelt beside him, her touch gentle as she pressed a cloth to the wound. "You fought with your voice," she whispered, eyes shining with fierce pride, "and with your heart." Halvard's fingers closed around hers, weak but unbroken. "We fight for what we believe, for what we love." The village breathed as one, the weight of old fears lifting like mist in the morning sun. The battle was not just won by steel or strength, but by the courage to challenge the past and embrace the uncertain promise of change. In the days that followed, Jarl Erik called the clan to the great hall once more. The air was thick with anticipation and the echoes of the recent storm. Gunnar was absent, his presence banished by choice or consequence. But the shadow of his challenge lingered. The Jarl's voice rang clear, steady with the authority earned through years of wisdom. "Ravnholm has faced a trial not of battle alone, but of spirit. The Skald's words, the widow's courage, and the child's fragile life have shown us a path beyond fear." Eyes turned to Halvard, to Sigrid, to the small figure of Ira standing quietly beside them. The room was heavy with unspoken acknowledgment that the old ways could bend, that honor was not a cage, but a forge. "Let it be known," the Jarl declared, "that Ravnholm will no longer bind its people with chains of fear. Let the widow choose her path, and let the Skald lead us not just in song, but in the strength of our shared future." A murmur of approval rose, growing until it became a roar of assent.
The traditions that once seemed immovable were shifting, like ice breaking beneath a warming sun. Halvard closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the clan around him. He could not see the faces, but he knew their hearts were open, their minds turned toward a new dawn. Beside him, Sigrid's hand found his, steady and sure. Ira's small fingers curled around theirs, a silent promise of life, of hope, of stories yet to be told. In the midst of winter's grasp, Ravenholm had found its light, and the blind Skald, once cast aside and silenced, had become the voice of a future where sight was measured not in eyes, but in courage, compassion, and the unyielding will to be free. The dawn crept quietly over Ravenholm once again, but this morning carried a different weight. The air, still cold and crisp, felt charged with a fragile hope that permeated the frozen ground beneath the villagers' feet. The long night of battle, fear, and uncertainty had passed, leaving behind bruised bodies and hearts, but also something more profound, a chance for healing, for redemption. Inside the great hall, sunlight filtered weakly through narrow shuttered windows, painting pale stripes across the wooden floor. The smell of damp wool and smoke lingered, mingling with the faint scent of earth and sweat, remnants of the recent struggle. The space was filled with an uneasy stillness, broken only by the low murmurs of those who gathered, their voices tentative but alive with the possibility of change. Halvard sat near the hearth, fingers resting lightly on the worn strings of his harp, now silent after the melody that had carried their fight. His body still ached. Deep wounds ached beneath the surface, the marks of Gunnar's wrath and the harshness of battle. But his spirit held firm. Beside him, Sigrid sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes steady yet wary. The child, Ira, sat close, her small form wrapped in layers of wool and furs, her gaze hesitant but growing stronger with each passing day. The villagers looked on, their gazes shifting between the Skald, the widow, and the fragile child who had come to represent so much more than innocence. Some eyes held grudging respect, others still held shadows of fear and doubt. But all carried the weight of witnessing something new, something that unsettled the very foundations of their traditions and beliefs. Jarl Erik stood at the center of the hall, his stature commanding the attention of all. His white hair caught the light, and the deep lines on his face told stories of winters weathered and battles fought, both in body and in mind. He raised his hand, and silence fell like a cooling balm over the room. People of Ravenholm, his voice was steady and somber, carrying the gravity of a leader burdened with the care of his clan. We have endured much in these past moons. We have faced threats from without and turmoil from within. The night storm tested our strength, but more importantly, it tested our hearts. He paused, eyes sweeping over the faces gathered before him. Halvard Olafsson, blind Skald and keeper of our tales, has stood against not only those who would tear us apart, but also the darkness that binds our minds and traditions. Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir, widow and bearer of grief, has shown courage that defies the cold grip of custom.
And the child, Ira, whose life has become a beacon in our midst, reminds us of the fragility and strength of hope. A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd, soft but growing. The path has not been easy, the Jarl continued, and the scars run deep. Yet it is in the facing of our deepest fears that we find the possibility of healing. The clan's judgment on the Skald and the widow has been harsh, but today we seek not to punish further, but to understand and to forgive. Halvard's heart quickened at the Jarl's words. Forgiveness, an elusive, precious gift.
He glanced at Sigrid, whose eyes met his with a mixture of relief and cautious hope. The Jarl's gaze settled on Gunnar's empty place at the hall's edge, a void heavy with the memory of conflict and cruelty. Gunnar Stonehands has chosen exile rather than reconciliation. His absence will be felt, but so too must we feel the void his fury has left behind. A silence followed, thick and contemplative. Therefore, Eirik declared, let it be known that from this day forward the laws of Ravnholm shall bend with wisdom and compassion. No longer shall grief be a prison, nor tradition a chain that binds the heart against its will. A ripple of whispers passed through the hall, astonishment mixing with cautious hope. The widow shall honor her mourning in her own time, but the choice of her future belongs to her alone. Halvard Olafsson shall be restored not only as Skald, but as a voice of the clan, a symbol of resilience and change. Halvard felt a warmth spread through his chest, a lightness where there had been only heaviness before. The acceptance he had longed for, the redemption he had dared to hope for, was now woven into the fabric of their shared story. From the corner, Freydis Gunhildsdottir, the village healer, stepped forward. Her eyes, pale and knowing, held a quiet strength that cut through the lingering tension. She approached Halvard with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands clutching a small bundle wrapped in linen. "This is for you," she said softly, "a gift of healing and protection." Unwrapping the cloth, she revealed a delicate amulet carved from bone, etched with runes of protection and courage, symbols meant to guard the wearer against darkness and despair. Halvard's fingers closed gently around the talisman, feeling its rough edges and the power nestled within. "Thank you, Freydis," he murmured, voice thick with gratitude. "Your wisdom and kindness are gifts as vital as the breath of the gods." Freydis nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "We all carry burdens and wounds, but together we carry the strength to heal." The villagers gathered closer, some stepping forward to offer their own gestures of goodwill. Nods, quiet words, the tentative reaching out of hands once clenched in accusation. The walls of suspicion and fear began to crumble, brick by brick, replaced by fragile threads of community and understanding.
Sigrid rose then, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the crowd. "I have lived in the shadow of loss and the weight of tradition. But I stand before you now, not as a broken woman, but as one who claims her right to choose her path. I ask you to see me not only as a widow, but as a woman of this clan, deserving of respect and freedom." Her words carried across the hall, stirring hearts and minds. Some faces softened, others hardened in thought, but none were untouched. Halvard reached out, taking Sigrid's hand in his. The touch was a silent vow, of partnership, of hope, of a future forged not in fear, but in love. The child, Era, small and quiet, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be heard. "Thank you," she said simply, looking up at those around her, "for seeing me, and for letting me be." The hall was still again, suspended in a moment of profound transformation. The fragile peace that had settled over Ravnholm was not the end, but the beginning, a chance to rewrite their sagas, to honor the past without being shackled by it. Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of ravens and the distant call of the wild. The sun, low but steady, promised the slow thaw of winter's grip, a reminder that even in the coldest darkness, life endures. As the villagers began to disperse, their steps lighter and voices softer, Halvard sat back down beside the hearth.
His harp rested at his side, silent but ready for the next song. A song not just of battles won or lost, but of hearts opened and lives intertwined. Sigrid settled beside him once more, and for a moment they simply existed in the quiet warmth between them. No words were needed. The simple touch of their hands spoke volumes. Halvard's thoughts drifted to the future, a future uncertain but filled with possibility. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenge, but for the first time in many winters it was a road he would walk not alone. In the depths of his blindness he had found a new kind of sight, a vision not of what the eyes could see, but of what the heart could know. And in that vision he saw a clan transformed, not by the strength of arms or the rigidity of laws, but by the courage to embrace change, to forgive, and to love. The saga of Halvard Olafsson, the blind Skald, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the narrow windows of the great hall, casting faint shadows that danced upon the worn wooden floor. The air was still, heavy with the quiet that follows a storm, both outside and within the hearts of Ravenholm's people. The long winter had not yet loosened its grip, but beneath the chill a new warmth began to pulse, a fragile ember of change, nurtured by courage and the breaking of old chains. Halvard sat near the hearth, the steady glow of embers reflecting faintly in the pale blue sheen of his sightless eyes.
The scars along his side still throbbed, reminders of the battle fought not with swords, but with words and faith amid fire and fury. His harp rested quietly at his side, silent now, but ever ready to sing the next tale when the time came. His fingers, steady though weathered, traced the worn wood, feeling the familiar grooves and notches, a tactile map of his journey. Beside him, Sigrid moved with careful grace, her mourning veil no longer a mask of sorrow, but a banner of resilience. The lines of grief remained etched softly on her face, her green-gray eyes carrying the weight of loss, but also the fierce light of someone who had chosen to live beyond it. She reached out, her hand finding his, and their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture, yet charged with promises unspoken. The child, Ira, sat wrapped in furs near the fire, her eyes bright despite the hardships etched in the fine lines of her small face. She watched the two quietly, a silent witness to the new dawn unfolding before her. Though she spoke little, her presence had become a symbol of innocence, survival, and the possibility of new beginnings amid the frost-bitten scars of Ravenholm. The village outside began to stir, the usual rhythms of daily life returning with a hesitant but steady pulse. Hunters prepared their gear, smiths stoked fires with renewed purpose, and mothers called their children from the snow-covered fields. Word of the recent trials had spread beyond the borders, carried by travelers and traders who marveled at the tale of the blind Skald and the widow who had dared to defy tradition together. But within Ravenholm, the story was only just beginning to be understood. The old ways, once unyielding as the frozen rivers that bordered their lands, had begun to bend, not broken, but reshaped by the strength of compassion and the stark light of truth. The council, led now more thoughtfully by Jarl Erik, had opened its ears and hearts to voices once silenced by fear. Halvard had been invited to take his place among the council's ranks, not merely as a Skald, but as a voice of wisdom and change. His blindness, once seen as a weakness, was now understood as a form of vision deeper than sight, a gift that allowed him to perceive the unseen threads that wove the community together. The morning sun crept higher, casting a golden glow on the village's snow-capped roofs. Children played cautiously near the woodpile, their laughter fragile as the cracking ice on the frozen river.
Women moved through the market square, their faces freer of suspicion, their steps lighter with the lifting of old burdens. Sigrid stood at the edge of the square, the silver brooch given by Forbade still pinned to her plain woolen dress, a reminder of the past, but no longer a shackle. Her eyes scanned the horizon, not with fear, but with resolve. The days of enforced mourning and silent submission were giving way to choices forged by the heart. She had reclaimed her voice, and with it, her freedom.
Halvard stepped beside her, his hand finding hers once more. "The clan will never be the same," he said quietly. "And it should not be. It is a living thing, growing with each story, each choice." Sigrid nodded, her gaze steady. "We have changed the song the Skald will sing, no longer only of warriors and gods, but of love, loss, and the strength to choose." As they walked through the village, villagers greeted them with nods and murmurs of respect. Some still glanced with lingering doubt, but many wore expressions softened by understanding and hope. The wounds inflicted by Gunnar's fury and the shadows of rigid tradition were healing, slowly knitting the community back together. Over the following moons, Ravnholm witnessed a quiet renaissance. The old feasts and rituals were observed with renewed meaning, no longer mere repetitions of the past, but living ceremonies that embraced both honor and humanity. The mourning veil, once worn as a symbol of enforced sorrow, became a personal choice rather than a compulsory weight. Ira, the child who had come to symbolize this fragile hope, grew stronger each day. Under the careful guidance of Freydis, the village healer, she learned the herbs and rites of their people, her laughter a balm to those still scarred by loss. She was no longer the frightened child hidden in shadows, but a young woman blossoming in the light of belonging. A morning came when a traveler arrived at Ravnholm's gates, a young woman from distant lands, her hair dark and eyes sharp with curiosity. She carried a bow slung across her back and a satchel filled with strange seeds and tales of places beyond the fjords. The villagers watched cautiously, but Halvard saw in her the spark of a kindred spirit, a seeker of stories, a bearer of new paths. He greeted her with the warmth of a man who had learned that sight was not limited to eyes. "Welcome," he said softly, "to Ravnholm, where the old and new are woven together." The traveler smiled, her voice steady. "I have heard of the blind Skald and the widow who dared change the tide. I have come to learn, and perhaps to stay." News of the stranger spread quickly, and within days she was accepted among the villagers, not as an outsider, but as a bearer of fresh stories and seeds for new growth. Her arrival marked the unfolding of yet another chapter in Ravnholm's saga, a testament to openness and renewal. As the seasons turned, Halvard and Sigrid's bond deepened, their partnership a quiet rebellion against all that sought to confine them. When the final moon of Sigrid's mourning passed, she shed her veil, not as a symbol of submission, but an emblem of rebirth. Their union was celebrated not with grand fanfare, but in the simple gathering of friends and kin, voices raised in song, hands joined in solidarity, hearts beating in shared hope. One evening, as the village rested beneath a sky brushed with stars unseen to Halvard's eyes, he sat beside the fire, his harp cradled gently. His voice rose in a melody that carried across the still, cold air, a song not just of past trials, but of the dawn of a new way. He sang of darkness and light intertwined, of blind eyes seeing truths hidden from the sighted, of hearts breaking free from chains forged by fear. His words wove a tapestry of love and courage, honor and change, a song that would be carried forward through generations as a beacon in the long night. Sigrid sat close, her hand in his, the warmth of their shared journey radiating between them. Ira and the traveler listened, their faces alight with the promise of all that was yet to come.
The fire crackled softly, the night air whispered through the trees, and the story of Ravnholm, of the blind Skald and the widow who fed him, stretched out into the future, an unbroken thread of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. In the end, Halvard understood what the gods had long tried to teach mortals, that sight is not the measure of a man's worth, nor the chains of tradition the measure of a clan's strength. True vision arises in the courage to see beyond the shadows, to embrace the light within, and to forge a path where none existed before. And so, beneath stars he could not see, a blind Skald sang his soul into the night. His voice a torch passed from hand to hand, lighting the way for all who dare to dream beyond the darkness. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting a soft, fading light across the worn timbers of the great hall. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the birch trees, carrying faint echoes of a world both ancient and ever-changing. Inside, Ravnholm's people had settled into a fragile quiet, their hearts and minds still stirred by the weight of recent days. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine smoke and the faint tang of spilled mead, a lingering reminder of celebration and struggle intertwined. Halvard sat near the hearth, his harp resting on his lap, fingers tracing the worn wood, as if reading a familiar tale. His sightless eyes reflected not the flicker of the flames, but the vast landscapes of memory and hope that stretched beyond the confines of the village. The weight of his journey rested deep in his bones, the pain of loss, the sting of betrayal, the warmth of love found in the darkest hours. Each breath he took was a thread woven into the tapestry of a story still unfolding. Beside him, Sigrid's hand found his, their fingers entwining in a quiet bond, forged through fire, sorrow, and unyielding courage. Her mourning veil had long since been folded away, replaced by a quiet strength that shone brighter than any ornament. Her gaze, steady and clear, met his with a shared understanding. Two souls who had walked through shadow and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The child, Ira, curled against a fur-lined bench nearby, her fingers tracing the carved runes on a wooden talisman gifted by Freydis.
Her growth had been slow but steady, a testament to survival in a world that had offered little mercy. Though her voice remained soft, her presence had become a symbol, a living emblem of resilience and the fragile promise of new beginnings. Outside the village, the frozen landscape stretched wide and indifferent, yet within the walls of Ravnholm something more profound had taken root. The old customs, once rigid and unyielding like the ice that gripped the rivers, had softened under the warmth of defiance and compassion. The people had learned that traditions need not be prisons, and that honor could be found not only in the battlefield, but in the courage to change. Halvard's thoughts drifted to the countless stories he had sung, the sagas of gods and men, of heroes and monsters, of battles won and lost. Now his own saga was etched deeply into the heart of Ravnholm, a narrative of a blind Skald who saw with the soul, of a widow who chose love over obligation, and of a child whose very existence challenged the chains of fate. The voices of the clan, once sharp with judgment and fear, had softened into whispers of acceptance and hope. Even Jarl Erik, the steadfast leader whose years weighed heavily upon him, had opened his heart to the possibility that change was not a threat but a necessity. The council now included the Skald's voice, not just as a keeper of tales, but as a bearer of wisdom, guiding their people through uncertain times with words that pierced where swords could not. Sigrid's voice broke the silence, gentle yet resolute. The world beyond Ravnholm is vast and ever-shifting. We have learned that to survive, we must see not only with our eyes, but with our hearts.
Halvard nodded, a small smile touching his lips. The gods have many faces, and so does fate. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in the courage to rewrite the sagas we inherit. Ira shifted, her youthful voice soft but clear. I am not afraid anymore. I have found a home where I am seen, truly seen. The warmth in the room grew, not just from the fire, but from the shared understanding that they were no longer bound by the shadows of the past. Each of them carried scars, visible and hidden, but they bore them as marks of survival, not chains of limitation. The night deepened, the embers glowing faintly, as Halvard lifted his harp once more. His fingers plucked the strings with delicate care, weaving a melody that seemed to rise beyond the walls, carrying their story to the stars he could no longer see. The song told of darkness that births light, of bonds forged in defiance and hope, of a clan willing to embrace the unknown. His voice rose, steady and clear, filling the hall with a resonance that touched every soul present. It was not a song of conquest or glory, but of humanity, of love that transcends loss, of honor found in choice, and of the strength it takes to see beyond sight. When the last note faded into silence, a profound stillness settled.
The firelight cast long shadows, and in those shadows the faces of Ravnholm's people shone with quiet promise. Halvard's gaze lifted, sensing the depth of their attention. "We are all blind in some way," he said softly. "Blind to the limits we place on ourselves, blind to the fears that bind us. But if we listen, truly listen, we can find the light that guides us through the darkness." Sigrid squeezed his hand gently, her smile reflecting the dawn of something new. "And in that light we are free." Outside, the wind carried the faint cry of a raven, a reminder that the old world still watched, but that a new story was being written. One not just of gods and warriors, but of hearts brave enough to love and change. As the night wore on, the village settled into a peaceful quiet, the air thick with the promise of a future shaped by courage and compassion. The saga of Halvard Olafsson, the blind Skald, was far from over. It was a song yet to be sung, a path yet to be walked, a light yet to fully dawn. For in the end, true sight is not found in the eyes, but in the heart's unwavering vision. And so, beneath stars unseen but ever felt, a blind Skald's voice became a beacon, a call to all who dare to see beyond the shadows. If this tale has moved you, if the journey of courage and change resonates in your heart, consider walking with us further. Subscribe to join the next chapter, where stories of honor, conflict, and human spirit continue to unfold beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. For in every ending there is a beginning, and every saga deserves to be heard. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.